Stories told of a daughter who was so embarrassed by her mom's appearance that she didn't even want to look at her mom sometimes, but she certainly didn't want friends to look at her mom. Her mom had been burned on the back of her arms and her back and down her legs on the backside. And she was embarrassed by her mom's appearance. Her mom never talked about it, never told her what had happened, what caused that. If the daughter asked, the mother wouldn't reply to that. The father never talked about it either. The daughter just could not hardly take looking at her mom. So one day the daughter said something to her mom. The mom got up and walked out of the room. The dad says, "Come here, I want to talk to you." So he brought his daughter over to him. He set her down and he said, "There was a wreck one day. And without hesitation, your mom jumped into the back seat of that car to protect a little baby. And she was burned protecting that child, but got the child out of the car." The daughter kind of put her hand over her mouth and said, "I didn't know the story. Mom's a hero. How's the baby? Did the baby make it? Is the baby okay?" And the dad said, "You're the baby." The mother had protected the daughter. And in doing that, the mother, who now was scarred, in the daughter's eyes, those scars became stars. Today, that's what we're going to talk about, turning scars into stars. I don't remember which military branch it was, but one of them used to have a commercial in the 70s. "When the going gets tough, the tough gets going," was the commercial. And I think that applies to us today also. Frankly, there's times when we're hit with bad news, when we're hit with bad circumstances, when bad events take place in our life that knock us for a loop. When the going gets tough, the tough need to get going. More often than not, whenever those circumstances come along, a lot of people will rise to the occasion. They'll begin to put into play a plan to help them walk their way through those bad times. They meet the challenges face on, and they focus their attention on how much better it will be after those things have been put aside than they were during them. On the other hand, we also know of person or persons who have been hit with those tough times, those challenges that come along, who haven't fared as well. Something unexpected happened in their life, and they folded underneath the pressure of that. Sometimes they even went as far as to blame God for those adverse times in their life. A former preacher, friend of my family's, was so solid in the pulpit, and he proclaimed God's word in such a powerful way. But just within a short period of time, his wife left him, and about 2 months after that, his oldest daughter was killed in a car wreck. He became so angry with God that he stepped out of the pulpit and just a short time later stepped out of the church. He had misdirected his anger toward God. I think everyone in this room probably knows somebody that has misplaced their anger toward God. We've also known of people who have been on cloud nine, so to speak. You just never see them down. They're always in a good mood, always happy, always looking for some new adventure in their journey on this earth. And I really love those people. Now, I'm going to use some bad English here. I ain't one of those people. I'm not. I don't consider myself to be optimistic, but I don't consider myself to be pessimistic. I think I'm a realist. But to those who are constantly optimistic, thank you so much, because you balance out the pessimistic person beautifully. Preachers sometimes tell a story of an optimistic farmer. He had many, many acres of land, but he was always in a good mood about it. He always had a very positive frame of mind. His neighbor was a pessimistic farmer. He couldn't stand life, it seemed like. everybody was out to get him. They would do things together. They'd be out in their truck riding around, and it would start pouring down rain, and the pessimistic farmer would say to the optimistic farmer, well, I guess our crops are going to flood. The optimistic farmer would say, oh, don't say that. God's providing us rain. We don't even have to turn on our irrigation system. They'd be out riding around a few days later, and maybe the sun had been out for a few days. The pessimistic farmer would say, oh, our crops are going to burn up. The optimistic farmer would say, oh no, God's providing us vitamin D free of charge. So there was an optimistic viewpoint, a pessimistic viewpoint. One day they were both on the back 40. They realized as they just finished loading up the truck that they needed to get to town pretty quick to a co-op meeting, and so they jumped in the truck, and the optimistic farmer said, I'm going to just cut right through here. I won't have to go all the way back up to the front. I can get on the gravel road and head into town right here. The pessimistic farmer said, don't forget that big ditch. You're going to have to go through that. And he said, I will be all right. They got there, they started up through the ditch, they started up, and sure enough, the truck got stuck. With two wheels stuck up in the air in the front, and the bumper dug into the ground in the back. So they weren't going to go forward or backward. They were going to have to call a tow truck. The optimistic farmer got out of the truck with great difficulty, and so did the pessimistic farmer. They walked around to the front. The pessimistic farmer thought, you know what? He's going to blow a gasket when he sees this. This will be the time I finally get to see him upset. The optimistic farmer just kept looking at the truck. And so the pessimistic farmer finally said, well, what do you think? And the optimistic farmer said, well, you know, while it's up in the air like this, I think I'll change the oil on it. You ever had a person like that? That optimistic? With that frame of mind? Today I want to take just a few minutes to talk about turning scars into stars. Billy Burden, a motivational speaker and a motivational author, back in the 70s especially, wrote several books, but one of them was entitled, that very title, Turning Scars into Stars. It became a bestseller. Basically what this book did was it took stories of famous people and average, common people and told those stories in written form. And in those stories, you found great examples about people who were faced with adverse situations in their life that overcame those situations and came out better on the other side of them than when they entered them. One such name, some people my age in here will remember the name, Art Linkletter. He was a common fixture on TV in the late 50s, all throughout the 60s, and into the 70s. At the height of his career in 1969, his daughter Diana took her life. She took too many drugs and she ended up throwing herself out of a high-rise window. He had to deal with that. That was a terrible thing that happened to that family. But after that, Art Linkletter set out, went to NBC and asked them if it would be okay if he did some public broadcasting messages on drugs. They allowed him to do that, and he did a lot of them. And what he did in that was help a generation of kids combat drugs. He took that scar in his life and he turned it into a star. So I very much appreciate Billy Burden and his book. But I don't need that book to teach me about how to turn a scar into a star. All throughout the pages of the Bible, we can read about individuals that did that very thing. They were met with tragedy in their life. They loved Christ enough that they were willing to persevere through that. And they took that terrible event and turned it into a very positive thing for the Lord. And one such individual is the very author of what was read just a few moments ago by Melvin, the Apostle Paul. He penned those letters, and in that I think it teaches us how to accomplish turning these scars into stars. Think about it just for a moment. Paul was completely innocent, yet he found himself in prison. At this time of the writing, he was in dire straits. Death seemed to be impending to him, imminent. We're perhaps where most of us would be writing a letter to a governor to ask for clemency, or writing a letter to a local newspaper telling them about how unjust the criminal justice system is. Paul penned one of the greatest letters of inspiration, one of the greatest letters of encouragement to the church at Philippi. And in that letter, in just one sentence, he really personifies the theme of the whole book. He says in verse 21, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Now to me that's an unbelievable and very courageous statement that he made. In that statement you see a person who understands both life and he understands death. Paul placed things in their proper perspective when he made that statement. In life and death, he was going to give God the glory because he was walking in harmony with God all throughout his Christian life. A noted author and a poet of his day, J. Foster, wrote the following words to a friend who was dying at the very time that he himself, Mr. Foster, was dying. This is what he said to his friend. "I congratulate you and myself that life is passing fast away. What a superlative, grand, and consoling idea is that of death." Now granted, you and I may not have written something like that, but that was his perspective on death. Because to him, the most cruel thing that could happen is for a person to become sick and have to live eternally in that state of being sick. Death is just as much a part of life as our birth is. And if we could adjust to that fact, all of us, we might just have the same attitude when faced with death that the Apostle Paul had. I don't remember the individual that penned the article that was entitled 4 Things to Know About Death, but here they are. First, don't deny death. The Bible tells us it's appointed that a man wants to die, and after that the judgment. Don't deny death, but rather prepare for death. Second, learn to live in the physical world because we're not going to be taken out of the physical world until that time comes. So learn to live in the physical world, but maybe we would be well advised to place more emphasis not on the physical world, but on the spiritual world and those things that come our way that way. For example, I was born in 1958, but spiritually I was reborn in 1968. Maybe I should pay more attention to that date rather than the 1958 date. 3, always be ready because you do not know the hour. And 4, start right now relinquishing life. Turn over some of your responsibilities, spiritually speaking and physically speaking, so that when you're gone, people will be able to cope better with that. Quickly, just 3 things I want to share with you regarding Philippians 1:19 through 21. Both in life and in his impending death, Paul knew God would provide his deliverance. He was going to be delivered one way or the other. And I think we forget that lesson sometimes. If we are true and faithful to God, if we walk the way God would have us to walk, he will deliver us one day. Sometimes our deliverance will be in the physical form. We've been sick maybe for a while. I've been praying about it to get over a sickness. Maybe y'all have been praying for me to get over that sickness. And God delivers us from that sickness. To God be the glory for such a deliverance. Sometimes our deliverance is spiritual or heavenly. We go through the pain and suffering of this life. People pray, but we're not delivered physically. We're delivered spiritually. We step from this life over to the next life. And for that deliverance, to God be the glory also. You see, there's a better place to live than this earth. It's heaven. And we can go there. And really, if we want to know the truth, as long as we're true and faithful, that's exactly where our citizenship is. It's in heaven. So not only does God provide for our deliverance, but secondly, in our deliverance, if we're true and faithful, Christ will be exalted and praised. You see, while we're living, we have the opportunity to exalt the name of Christ above all other names. And Paul did that very thing. But when we die, if we've had that faithful life, through the examples that we set, even in our death, we can exalt the name of Christ. So how many times have you been to a funeral of a member of the Lord's body? And when the memories of that person's shared, you sit there and you start thinking, and your heart begins to be filled with love and joy for that individual. Because the more and more they tell the stories, the more and more you see the great example that they set in their life. And when you come away from that funeral, you have a really good feeling about where that person will spend their eternity and how that motivated you. That life of that individual motivates you to want to do even more for Christ. See, even in death, Christ can be glorified through a life. Not only will God provide for our deliverance, and not only will Christ be glorified in our life and in our death, but it should help motivate us to new heights, spiritually speaking. To want to have the mindset that dying is just as equal as life is. Several years ago, while I was reading this very opening of verses 19 through 21, I added just a couple of verses to 21, and I got over to verse 23. And I saw something that I'd never seen before with Paul. Because in verse 23, he doesn't say that dying is better. But in verse 23, he says dying is much better. And what he's saying here carries the thought with it of a ship that has been loaded with the cargo. And it's sitting in the port. And the anchor is still down, holding that ship back from fulfilling its purpose. And it's only when that anchor is raised and that ship sets sail to its final destination that the purpose is really fulfilled of that ship. And that's metaphoric language for us to understand today. God has blessed us with this life. But in order for us to really fulfill life, we're going to have to raise that anchor up one day and set sail on our final destination to be with Him in heaven forever. We should find great comfort in realizing that our Christian journey, if we're true and faithful, is not walked by ourselves, but God walks with us on that journey. Every step of the way, at our conversion, He's with us. When we're teaching other people about Him, He's with us. When we go through all those tough times in life, He's with us. And yes, even in death, He's with us on that journey. We're guaranteed that in Scriptures. Even to the end of the ages, He's with us. So let me wrap this up. Paul lived in a very, very interesting life. He was persecuted, but don't forget, he also persecuted. That's the irony of his life. At first he persecuted the church, and later he became one of the greatest missionaries of that very church he persecuted. He didn't live in a rose garden, nor did he wear rose-colored glasses. He was treated very bad by fellow humans in a very unfair way along the way. He still knew, though, that if God was to grant him just a few more years on this earth, just a little bit more time on this earth, he already knew exactly what he would do with that added time. He was going to preach Christ and Him crucified. And yet, if God was to call him home at that very moment, it would be to his gain for that to happen. So I want to leave you with this thought. Where are you today in that journey? Have you been able to turn your scars into stars? Have you been able to move beyond those things that have come along in your life? Are you blaming the wrong person for what has happened to you? Is God still your focal point? Is Christ still your focal point to fix your eyes on and to be moving in that direction? Have you rolled your sleeves up, and are you busy for the kingdom today? If you are, thank you so much, because you're setting a tremendous example for all of us to follow. But if you're not, you can do something about that this very day. If you haven't become a New Testament Christian yet, if you haven't entered the watery grave of baptism, you certainly have the opportunity today to do that. So let's just say, just for a moment, that you've been through the Bible school ministry that we have, you've studied, and you've sat there and thought, do I need to become a New Testament Christian? You know God's plan of salvation, and you know the direction that God would have you to go. I would tell you, yes, today's the day of salvation. Today's the very day that you can become a New Testament Christian. But let's just say some things have come along after you've been baptized that have slowed you down, that have hindered you from fulfilling the purpose of your life. And you know you've let that happen. Wouldn't you want to seize the moment, this moment, to get back to where you need to be? You're going to have that opportunity also in just a moment. If you want to talk to the elders about it in private, please do so. They'll be standing at the back doors. If you want to come down and make a more public response to that, you have that opportunity today also to turn scars into stars. Remember this passage. Fear not that which you are about to suffer. Be thou faithful through death, and you'll receive a crown of life in heaven. If you need to respond, please do so as we stand and as we sing.